So hopefully you've been duly warned. All right. Great. We're recording. Thanks everybody for being here on this Friday afternoon. We're really happy to have Anthony Feldman and Anli as our speakers today. So Anthony's going to go first, correct?
Mhm.
Okay, great. Well, Anthony is an assistant professor of soil geochemistry at Desert Research Institute based in Las Vegas. His research covers a range of quaternary soil and geomorphology topics, as well as Martian analog research. We get to hear about Mars later today, too. That's great. His dissertation focused on the effects of climate and the production of X-ray amorphous material in soils to better understand climatic interpretations from the presence of such material on Mars. Current interests include such analog work as well as projects focusing on glacial geomorphology and lake quaternary paleoclimate, the role of dust in the development of desert and alpine soil systems, and the effects of soil variability for military applications.
Mhm.
All sounds
Uh,
great. I'm going to share with, oops.
cool. Thank you,
Yeah, go
Ben.
ahead and share. I think I've set it up for you to share,
Yes.
Anthony.
And we all see the presentation.
Not yet.
Okay. Let me see. Okay. That should be. Can everybody see?
Here it comes. Yep, I think we got it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, like Ben said, I'm Anthony Feldman with the Desert Research Institute based out of Las Vegas, Nevada. I'm going to be presenting hopefully some work that will be submitted for review within the next month or two. I've been working on this project with collaborators Leif Anderson at the University of Utah, Brad Sion and Janelle Bastard, also here at Desert Research Institute, and then a friend of mine, Keith Brugger from the University of Minnesota Morris, now emeritus, I believe. And this is stemming from my master's work at New Mexico Tech with Bruce Harrison. For my master's, I went up and used soil relative age techniques to examine the ages of a glacial sequence in northern New Mexico at what we were terming Long Valley at the Costilla Massif, which is kind of just south of the border with Colorado. But I've had the opportunity through some internal funding here at DRI to go and get cosmogenic ages for those deposits. And so what I'm going to be presenting today is our interpretation of the ages of the Long Valley sequence there, one date from a nearby Cirque sequence, and then work with our colleague Leif Anderson to model the extent of a local ice cap covering the massif and examining the precipitation and temperature conditions that would have permitted its presence, and then subsequent transient modeling to model its collapse over time. The title of the talk is Relatively Cold Climatic Conditions in the New Mexican Sangre de Cristo Range Supported Local LGM Ice Caps and Holocene Cirque Glaciation, because one of the cosmogenic dates we got back was surprisingly young. And so we'll dig into that in a little bit. But why are we interested in this in the first place? So on the right over here is a figure I'm sure many people are familiar with from Pierce in 2003, showing the extent of glaciation across the western U.S. Glaciers were widespread across the Rocky Mountains, the Sierra Nevada, and such, even as far south as the Southwest, including in Arizona at White Mountain and near Flagstaff, and then throughout the New Mexican portion of the Sangre de Cristos, and even as far south as Sierra Blanca Peak near Ruidoso. However, much of the literature examining valley glaciers and ice cap presence has focused on more northerly regions, the Wind River in Wyoming, up through Idaho, and in Colorado in particular. Just as an example of this is the image on the left from Leonard et al. In 2017, kind of giving an approximation of some of the many glacial sequences that have been examined with using cosmogenic techniques throughout the state of Colorado. Whereas and we're focusing in this study again at the southernmost tip because there is, compared to those more northerly regions, a dearth of data for these sequences. And again, our particular field area is this Costilla Massif right at the border with Colorado here. There is a limited amount of work that's examined some other sequences in the southern portions of the Sangres, Keith Berger has done some work at the Blanca Massif. He has a recent publication with myself, Leif, and Brad, also looking at the Culebra Peak area just north of the Costilla Massif. And then there was some previous work done back in the 80s by Wessling, sort of relative age dating the Windsor watershed sequence near Santa Fe. And more recently, there's been some ages published by Marcotte and Leonard looking at Cirque glaciation and then the extent of LGM glaciation in the Windsor watershed. In addition to kind of this area just not having a plethora of sequences that have been examined, that's of interest because at least the modern climate in the region varies quite drastically from more northerly sections of the Rocky Mountains. It tends to have a much more summer monsoonal precipitation. And then during the LGM and throughout the late Quaternary, as this image from Shepard et al. In 2002 is showing, it's kind of thought that there was the potential for cyclonal systems or sort of weather patterns from that might have more mirrored weather that was, or that weather that is similar to what we would have seen in the northern Rocky Mountains as opposed to in the more central regions. Now, one other reason that we're particularly interested in this sequence is a plethora of cirques that have moraines present. And that study I mentioned from Wessling in the 1980s had a radiocarbon date at the Windsor watershed suggesting neoglacial or Holocene glaciation. Marcotte went back to one of the other Cirque sequences in the area in 2019 and suggested that the deglaciation occurred actually in the late Pleistocene and that the presence of Holocene glaciation was likely anachronistic. Marcotte has also, in that same study, looked at similar sequences throughout the Western US, suggesting that many of the sequences that were determined to be neoglacial or Holocene using these relative age techniques are more likely, when examined using cosmogenic and absolute age dating techniques, to be latest Pleistocene. My colleague Leif has also sort of had preliminarily done some outlining of potential ice cap features in the area. And since I was going back up there to get some paleoclimate determinations, we thought we would match up and examine also some of the paleoclimate modeling to determine the extent of that ice cap, and we're focusing kind of right here on this northernmost section up here. So overall, the goals for our study, we have an overarching goal beyond this particular study of constraining the terminus or the timing of deglaciation at the southernmost terminus of glaciation in the Rocky Mountains. So this is a pilot study that we're hoping to turn into a larger study examining the extents and timing of glaciation throughout New Mexico and into Arizona. But the preliminary goal for this particular study and what I'm presenting here today is constraining the glacial history and paleoclimate of the Costilla Massif in the southern Sangre de Cristo Mountains at New Mexico. And just some initial findings before we dig into the results at large, just so you can keep this in your head, was we have the first direct confirmation of MIS-6 moraines in the state of New Mexico. We have one age date suggesting the presence of Holocene or neoglacial moraines in the southernmost Rocky Mountains, suggesting that there are the potential for the presence of such glacial activity in the southernmost Rocky Mountains. Our numerical modeling suggests a temperature depression of about 10.5 degrees Celsius, which is quite cold. And that the local ice cap disappeared roughly by about 16.5 thousand years ago, although there was some residual Cirque glaciation persisting after that. Methods that I'm sure many people here are familiar with. We mapped the glacial deposits in the area using aerial imagery, field recon, and a combination of GIS techniques. We use beryllium-10 cosmogenic dating. The entire area is almost exclusively a quartz monzonite, very rich in material for 10Be. And then our colleague Leif produced static and transient energy mass balance modeling to examine the extent of the ice cap at the last glacial maximum, and then step it up into the modern era to examine the deglaciation over time. And before we dig into the results, just kind of a fun image. This is one of the boulders we sampled with me for scale. And then on the right, we have my colleague Brad Sion chipping away some of the pucks that were used for the 10Be dating. So we are focusing on the Costilla Massif. It's this large sort of north-south extensive above tree line sequence right at the border with Colorado. You can see State Line Peak here on the border. And we are focusing primarily on dating the sequence called Long Valley, which is right in the center of the sequence. So State Line Peak is up here. And this is sort of a preliminary moraine crest map of the area with the moraine crests highlighted in red. On the right over here is a 3D representation of Long Valley. So we can see this large accumulation space and then kind of a bulldoze through the mountain front and then progradational lateral and terminal sequences extending out from the valley front. Looking at this on the panel over here on the left, we have A, B, and C, and that corresponds to mapping on the right over here, giving you an idea of the extent of terminal and lateral moraines. So in Long Valley, we have these two quite large extensional lateral moraines flanking the progradational glacial sequence. And then at the front, a sequence of terminal or recessional moraines out in front of those laterals, and then a very large progradational lobe extending out in front as the glacier spilled out onto the valley floor. The sites that we actually sampled for cosmogenic dating are given by these white triangles. So we have 3 samples from the southern portion of that large lateral sequence, 2 samples from one of the ridge lines right in front of the progradational lobe, 3 on this smaller lateral moraine right down here, which was mapped by Schroba in the 70s as being a potential MIS6 moraine. We collected 2 samples from part of the hummocky ground moraine inset within the large lateral sequence. And then to examine some of the timing of deglaciation in the cirques, we have 1 sample from up in Long Valley and then 1 sample from a little bit more northerly at the State Line Peak Cirque up at the border with Colorado. And before we get into the actual cosmogenic results, just kind of an image to place ourselves in the valley. On the top is looking from the top of that progradational lobe up into the valley, and then on the bottom is from the Cirque sequence itself, looking down the valley. So we can see that mountain front, sort of the bulldozer effect of the glacier moving through. What? No, sorry. Yeah, we can see where the glacier kind of bulldozed through the mountain front, and then that progradational sequence extending out to the valley floor. So what are the actual cosmogenic results we have? So on the bottom in panel A, we have from Long Valley, and B is the age from State Line Peak. And we can see a spread of ages from MIS6 all the way up to the Holocene. We have that lateral sequence that was mapped by Schroba as being MIS6. We're confirming as MIS6. We have a number of LGM-aged samples that range in age from about 24.5 to about 21.7. So we're potentially suggesting the LGM maximum extent was reached a little bit earlier here than maybe more northerly sections in Colorado. We have a Cirque age in Long Valley itself of about 15.2 thousand years, very similar to Marcotte's determination from the Windsor. And then we have what I think is one of the more interesting dates from the study is this 4.6 thousand year age from the State Line Peak Cirque. The MIS6 moraine ages ranged from about 179,000 to 146,000. On the right over here is just a PDF calculation from PCAT. And these ages are different enough that either that this moraine was formed over an exceedingly long period of time, or there's the potential for some inheritance in one of these samples. But again, we were confirmed. This is the first confirmation of an MIS6 presence. We knew it was likely to be there, but this is the first absolute age confirmation of the presence of MIS6 moraine material in these southernmost rocky sequences. We have fluctuations of the last glacial maximum. So we reached the maximum extent somewhere around about 24,000, 25,000 years. And then we have one age from about 21.7 on a separate ridge line inset within those large laterals, potentially suggesting some fluctuations or a small recessional as the glaciers came back up during warming post-LGM. In our latest Pleistocene Cirque moraine in Long Valley, 15.2. Again, this is very similar to what we see in the Windsor watershed with Marcotte. And so we do have that retreat of the glaciers post-LGM, but some stabilization in the latest Holocene. These are just some images showing the Cirque moraine itself. So we chose to sample from this large boulder you can kind of see in the image on the top up here, sitting on top of that green hill slope. just because in the center of the sequence itself, there was this what might have been a landslide deposit kind of covering up the progradational terminal section at the head of the valley. And then the state line peak with our Holocene age. So on the upper left over here, I've just kind of re-highlighted where that is in sequence. You can see an aerial image from Google Earth in the lower left, Brad standing next to the boulder we sampled, and then the actual age given on top of, given with its location on the moraine on the lower right. Most of the samples we tried to acquire were about 1 meter in height, just to limit snow effects on shielding. Nothing on this particular moraine was above about 0.5 meter in height. So this is the tallest boulder essentially that we could find that had a flat surface in order to be sampled. And we only managed to get one age from this area, but it is quite interesting to see that 4.6 post-Holocene climatic optimum age here, suggesting that we can have the presence of this Holocene glaciation in these southernmost Rocky Mountain areas. Now, we had some debate internally about whether this moraine was rock glacial, debris covered, or like true, like pure ice glacial activity. We tend to think that this is, just from our internal discussions, likely to be a debris covered, very small Cirque moraine. It's several hundred meters in altitude higher than the Cirque at Long Valley. We do have this nicely formed sort of progradational moraine shape. It's about 10 to 15 meters in altitude above the surrounding topography. And it has a very nice sort of ridge line topography to it, as you can see in these images. And so we do tend to think that this is, even if there was rock glacial activity at some point, that the moraine was formed initially through sort of debris covered glacial activity. Now, the paleoclimate modeling out of this, the part of the study that I have mostly conducted was the cosmogenic dating. Our colleague Leif has been conducting energy mass balance modeling using an updated version of the Plummer and Phillips model. And we're currently in the process of redoing some of the modeling right now to get a smaller data point size. Most of the models up to date we've done with 200 meter pixels. Leif is currently rerunning them with a 100 pixel size. So the images we have here are not the most up to date. I didn't manage to get those processed in time to put into the presentation here. So you'll have to bear with me on the exact numbers I'm giving you. But Leif has run a number of sequences at a variety of different temperature and precipitation conditions, and our best fit for the LGM positions of the ice cap and associated valley glaciers suggests a temperature depression of about 10.5 degrees Celsius when we use modern precipitation conditions. If we increase precipitation up to about 50% over modern conditions, we still see a temperature depression of about 9.5 degrees Celsius. So this is a quite large temperature depression in the area. We see extensive ice cap coverage, and we have a quite good match at that 10.5 degrees C deviation with easterly glacier positions, although there is something that we're trying to account for, which is that the model suggests that there should be these extensive but thin glaciers extending off to the west of the massif, and we cannot find geomorphic evidence for the extent of the glaciers that the modeling suggests should be present. So we have this dichotomy between the east and the west sides of the ice cap. Now, that temperature depression of about 10.5 degrees C is somewhat roughly similar, but still colder than what is predicted by Chelsea Trace for the area. But it's kind of still in the ballpark, even though it is a degree or two C colder than what is suggested for that area. One other thing that we've been looking at is that we do overtop the lateral sequence in Long Valley. We have a relatively thin ice cap coverage and valley glacier coverage. The maximum is about 200 meters. And we think that this is likely an artifact of some of the modeling, as well as the potential for the Long Valley Glacier to have been debris mantled and extending a little bit further. And just kind of to highlight what we're talking about, on the left over there is a hillshade of the area showing those large lateral sequences at the progradational lobe. And then we can see that in the current state of the model, we're overtopping those lateral sequences and forming a progradational lobe. It's just not extending quite out as far to the known position of that progradational material. And in addition to the static model determining the extent and paleoclimate conditions at the LGM, we've also been running a transient model using the Osmond mean curve to examine deglaciation of the ice cap. And we're suggesting total collapse of the ice cap around about 16.5 thousand years ago, with some of that residual Cirque glaciation persisting afterwards. Again, I know that the figure says about 15,000 years of age. That's just because I didn't have the ability to input our most recent results figures into the presentation right now. Now, in addition to kind of what I was talking about with the paleoclimate deviation, we've plotted the annual surface mass balance calculation against elevation and compared that to some modern glaciers around the world. And we kind of fit the profile for this paleoglacier fits kind of midway between what we see in the Alps and in modern sort of semi-arid island glacial ecosystems in Kazakhstan. So it does kind of suggest that we do see this semi-arid glacier forming. And so it's very similar to glaciers we see in very similar modern climatic conditions. I'm going to skip through this a little bit because I think I'm running out of time. But our colleague our colleague Keith Brugger had been running degree day modeling to complement the energy mass balance model in the area. We wound up having difficulties with that in this particular area because of mass movements and slumping and sort of having a difficult time delineating the exact extent of ice in the area. But we do have a recent publication out delineating or showing Keith's degree day modeling for the Culebra Peak area, which is just north of the field site that I've been presenting on today. And he and Keith's work suggested a very similar temperature depression, kind of averaging about 9.4 to 9.6 degrees Celsius using modern precipitation conditions. And again, that's very similar to the Chelsea Trace for that particular region. So kind of to sum everything up, we see that in our current study and in Keith's work, anywhere from about 9.5 to 10.5 degree temperature variation. This is similar to some of the very paleoclimate deviations we see in the northern Rocky Mountains, but significantly colder than we see in the central Rocky Mountains and throughout much of Colorado. And then kind of a summary before I get to any questions. Again, we have direct confirmation of the presence of MIS6 and neoglacial and potentially Holocene moraines in the area, a temperature depression of about 9.5 to 10.5 degrees Celsius, and the presence of this locally extensive ice cap, which likely disintegrated by about 16,500 years ago. Thank you, and I would take any questions.
All right, Anthony, thank you. That was really, really cool, multifaceted, beautiful maps. And we have plenty of time for questions. Looks like Jason had his hand up first.
Wow, I'm the winner, huh? Um, Thanks for that really wonderful talk. Super clear and really nice visuals. I I could ask a lot of questions about some elements of the chronology, but I'll maybe just ask one without getting into too much detail, which is what might be an explanation for first of all, your Bull Lake ages are it's rare to see Bull Lake ages that aren't like trickling down into the late Pleistocene, like 130, 140, 120, 110, whatever, like we did
Mm-hmm.
up at Twin Lakes. And ours were not quite as old as what you got. And then the LGM, the Pinedale moraines, your ages, as you pointed out, are a little bit on the old side compared to what other people are
Mm-hmm.
finding. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about, I know there's this far-flung thing and the terminus might be kind of just oscillating back and forth. And so it might be a little bit of a just, you know, um, chaotic about like what you might, or stochastic about what age you might end up getting. But if you believe that those older ages are meaningful, how might you interpret that?
Yeah, so our kind of the working hypothesis we've been running with is that if we have locally colder conditions than we found elsewhere, even within New Mexico or Colorado, that there might have been that we might have seen glaciers reaching their LGM positions maybe 1,000 or 2,000, 3,000 years before other sequences in the area. So that's kind of our initial thought was that if we do in fact have such significantly colder conditions in the area that might have supported sort of a glacial advance slightly earlier than we've seen in other areas. We've considered, again, kind of inheritance in the area. Since most of these samples do have that older age, we're kind of thinking that they are in fact representative of when the moraines would have been formed.
All right, great. Dick, go ahead.
Yeah, really great talk. I liked it a lot. I was curious about your thoughts on the Holocene moraine because the pictures you showed, it looks like it has an awfully rounded surface. The Holocene
Hmm.
moraines that I'm familiar with are very like chunky and angular and come to a nice peak. And you don't have any large boulders on it, which is also kind of curious because I would suggest the larger boulders to be more likely preserved up in the higher cirques where there's been less time to sort of degrade these things than lower, and you have larger boulders down there. And then my third question about the Holocene is 4,000 years seems like a really odd time because at least in the Sierra
Yep.
Nevada, there seems like if there were Holocene moraines, they kind of they start around 3,000 and then there's maybe, 2,800, 2,200, then LG or sorry, Little Ice Age, but I haven't really seen that 4,000 years. So I'm how confident are you in using one sample to confirm the Holocene age?
I wouldn't say that we're confident in using one sample as a sort of an exact confirmation. We are hoping to get back up to the area and collect additional samples from some of the other cirques up there. And so I would kind of say this is a preliminary indication as opposed to full confirmation of the presence, because it is, I would say, difficult to hang your hat off of only one sample. I do think that the moraine here has a very nice progradational shape to it. But again, you're kind of right. It is not exactly similar to what we see elsewhere in the Rocky Mountains and in the Sierras. But and so we're kind of one of the things we're potentially interested in is taking some transects across the ground moraine inset within the moraine and examining the internal structure to see if we might be able to get an idea of how much of the actual progradation would have been composed of rock versus ice material. And maybe trying to do some modeling to examine how the glacier progradation and see if we can sort of answer some of those questions because we kind of really just don't know. But I would say that we're tending to think that this is either a significantly debris covered glacier or kind of a very heavily ice matrixed rock glacier. And that the 4.6 age, as you were saying, is interesting because again, that's sort of almost immediately post Holocene thermal optimum. It's not in line with similar measurements elsewhere. And so, but since it's a minimum age, where I would hesitate to think that it is older than that because we would be getting into the Holocene climatic optimum in that point and unlikely to have glacial activity in the area if we were significantly warmer. And so it is kind of it's an interesting data point, and I would say it's suggestive of the presence of Holocene glaciation, but we do need to get back into that sequence and go to some of the other cirques in the area and see if we can replicate that finding elsewhere. Because yeah, we just did not have a lot of boulder material to work with up there, and so this one sample came back and we were like, that's quite interesting, but we don't have further confirmation of it.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, thanks.
I noticed in the chat, Leif Anderson wrote that boulder size is also dependent on the type of rock eroding and fracture spacing. Are they different lithologies up there with more fractured
It
rocks?
actually so basically the entire massif sequence is almost a single quartz monzonite unit.
Hmm.
There is some amphibolite up there, but we didn't collect any samples from amphibolitic material. So all of the samples we have are a fairly uniform quartz monzonite.
All right, and then jumping back to the MIS6 ages. Got a broad range of ages here, Anthony. There's a lot of questions to think about. But Joe Licciardi was asking if you assumed a rock surface erosion rate, or did you assume
Uh,
zero there?
we have not input an erosion rate into the calculations. We did include a shielding effect, but we have not input an erosion calculation yet.
All right, great. And still those ages land in MIS6. Sometimes when you apply an erosion rate, depending on what it is, you can get you can push something from like MIS5 back into MIS6. So be curious to see what that does.
I do kind of want to touch on Leif's comment about the boulder size. So, like I said, the one from State Line Peak was about half a meter tall, but all of the other boulders that we sampled were either almost, I think the smallest one we sampled outside of that was 80 centimeters. And most of them were approaching a meter to a meter and a half in height, with our sample collected at about a meter above the ground surface.
Okay.
And there really weren't we were the samples that we've collected from the lateral moraines and the terminal sequences in Long Valley are kind of the only ones we could actually find. There really aren't a lot of boulders of sufficient size in the sequence in order just existing in order to collect sample material from. So it's not there. It's kind of like we had to pick and choose based on what was available. There really aren't a whole lot of boulders in the area.
Well, a lot of us know that feeling well.
Yeah,
All right. Well, it is time for us to move on. Real quickly, I want to mention John Rydell pointed out that there are a few radiocarbon ages on alpine glacial advances in the Pacific Northwest in that 4.2 Ka range. So there might be some comparisons out there, and something to think about as you keep developing this chronology. So thanks again, Anthony. That was great. We're going to move on to our second speaker, An Lee, who is a fifth-year dual title PhD candidate in Earth and Space Sciences with astrobiology at the University of Washington. She studies how glaciers shape the landscape on Mars and Earth, specifically studying cirques and eskers. She also works on how water changed the chemistry of rocks on Mars using PIXL, a micro XRF instrument. Sorry, that's one I haven't heard of before, on the NASA Perseverance rover. An is currently most interested in post-glacial paraglacial morphology, as well as how rocks preserve mineralogical and geochemical evidence of deglaciation. So we're glad to have you here. If you want to go ahead and share your screen, we're ready for you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Switching gears a little bit because we're going to switch planets. But yeah, I'm excited to talk about Cirques on Mars. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, before getting started, I just like to thank my co-authors listed here for their contributions, as well as just acknowledging the funding source as well. So to give a very brief background of late Mars climate and glaciation on Mars as well, within the last billion years or so on Mars, there's been really limited to no liquid water on its surface. However, there is the presence of debris-covered cold-based glaciers in the mid-latitudes, as well as polar layered deposits of both the north and south caps. And so this image is an example from the mid-latitude, specifically looking at debris-covered ice. So this is the debris-covered ice, and then this is like a massif in the middle. So while most glaciation on Mars is understood to be cold-based, there is some limited depositional and erosional evidence as well of wet-based glacial erosion. So this includes sinuous ridges as an indication of eskers, as well as grooves as an indication of warm-based sliding glaciers. To go more into a little bit about the cold-based glaciation and the kind of different terms that we use for the types that exist on Mars, this is an image from Mars. So this is sometimes the Mars images look a little inverted from Earth. So I'm just going to add that this is higher topography, this is lower topography. So this is like a mesa and higher ground. So the two kind of groups of scales of glaciation and also ages of glaciation include 300 million years to a billion years for the larger features, and these include the lobate debris aprons as well as the lineated valley fill down here. And they're larger, so up to a kilometer thick and tens of kilometers long. And then on the smaller scale, so for example, right here, there's a glacier-like form. And these are thinner, so around 130 meters thick and only about 4.7 kilometers long. So the work that I'm going to talk about today is actually neither of those features, but instead looking at alcoves incised into the sides of these mesas as potential indication of previous glaciation and tying them as well into like cirques on Earth as an analog. So other potential analog landforms for alcoves include periglacial processes as well as groundwater sapping. But for this work, we're really just mostly focusing on Cirque-like alcoves that could have formed by glaciation. So this is just an example from Antarctica where you have cirques that can still have and retain ice as well. But for this work, we're really mostly focusing on cirque-like alcoves that don't have any glacial-like forms previously mapped within them. So just to give a background on terrestrial glacial cirques, typically you need some kind of initial concavity. So this could be like a fluvial valley head or a landslide scar needed for the snow to accumulate. And then while there are also periglacial and periglacial processes that contribute to cirque formation, generally people understand that cirques on Earth form from warm-based ice and abundant meltwater, so wet-based glaciation. And from over 10,000 cirques that have been reviewed on Earth, there are many different types that exist. And generally people are interested in cirques because they can be used as paleo-environmental indicators as evidence of where glaciation occurred and to what extent. So here are just kind of two areas or regions that have examples of cirques that are no longer glaciated. This is an example of a cirque-like alcove on Mars next to a cirque on Earth. One reason why we're interested in this feature on Mars is if they are in fact formed by warm-based or wet-based glaciation, then they could be a potential source of liquid water, as well as protection from radiation and diurnal temperature swings. So to address whether or not alcoves were previously glaciated, specifically in a region on Mars called Geolis Mensae, our approach is basically mapping alcoves across this region and then using morphometrics from Earth, as well as physical morphologies and geomorphic features to help determine which ones are most similar to cirques on Earth. So for mapping alcoves in Geolis Mensae, which is this region on Mars in the northern mid-latitudes, and just to orient everyone, this is a map of Mars where all of these circles represent volumes of glacier-like forms that have been previously mapped. To map these, we use context camera images, so satellite imagery from Mars, as well as high-resolution camera digital elevation models. And then we first mapped and classified almost 2,000 alcoves, but not necessarily saying that they are all glacially eroded. And then from that, we used that population and applied a tool called the automated cirque metric extraction tool. And in order to use that tool, you have to give the tool alcove shapes and threshold midpoints in ArcGIS, and then DEM as well. And then it outputs morphometrics. And the ones that we're most interested in included length, width, altitudinal range, area, slope, and aspect. And so using that tool, we obtained morphometrics, and then based on literature from Earth about the typical length versus width ratios, length versus height, and width versus height ratios, we then down selected to the most likely cirque candidates. And then we also combine that with classifying the most simple alcoves. So alcoves that really just have one head wall and side walls versus some of the other types of alcoves that are branching or have more complex features. And so by combining those two, we then narrowed it down to 434 cirque-like alcoves out of our initial nearly 2,000 alcove population. And so just to kind of give an overview of the types of morphometrics compared to Earth, they're about 11% larger than the average cirque on Earth. And here you can see like the length, width, and height are similar in terms of the median, but larger than Earth. And then the range is also larger than Earth. So one potential explanation for this is that you might have had more extended durations of glaciation on Mars. Another morphometric of interest that we looked at was aspect. So generally you can see there's this southeastward bias, but also generally just in the east and south directions as well. So the eastward bias is similar to cirques on Earth as well as glacier-like forms on Mars. And this is consistent with westerly winds. So you see this with cirques in the mid-latitudes because of westerly winds, but then on Mars as well, in Geolis Mensae, modeling has also shown that there are westerly winds expected. And so that bias makes sense. But then the southward bias is less expected because typically on Earth, you expect cirques to face poleward or preferentially face poleward. So one possibility to explain this is that we're actually seeing this bias because they formed at a higher obliquity when the equator facing direction was actually more favorable and there was less insolation. So currently Mars's obliquity is similar to Earth's at around 25 degrees, but in the past it's had obliquity fluctuations to over 30 degrees regularly. And so during those times, facing the equator was actually more favorable for ice formation than facing the poles. And this aspect bias is also interesting because of its potential connection to another type of landform that's also studied on Mars, which are gullies. And so gullies specifically at these latitudes actually also show a similar southward bias. And comparing the Cirque-like alcoves versus glacier-like forms in this region on Mars, we can see that while the average area of a Cirque-like alcove is much smaller than the average area of a glacier-like form, when we look at total area, because there are more Cirque-like alcoves, we're really expanding the area attributed to glaciation in this region. And there is still, however, this open question of, well, when did these Cirque-like alcoves form and what is the relationship with existing debris-covered glaciers on Mars? When we use Mars temperatures and gravity, Cirque-like alcoves can only have timescales similar to the smaller glacier-like forms if they're eroded by warm-based glaciers. But if we use cold-based erosion rates, then they would need to form over much longer timescales, similar to the lobate debris apron and the lineated valley fill. And in addition, we also identified different types of geomorphic features that are consistent with the presence of ice in these Cirque-like alcoves. So this is an example of one that actually still has ice-related features in it, even though these features hadn't been previously mapped as like a glacier-like form. We just wanted to point out that they still have evidence of ice within them. So just to point out a few of these features, these black dots are boulders or scree, and then related to ice, it's going to be a lot of terms that people who study Earth don't usually use, but they're all kind of like based on, or like they have like analogs relative to Earth. So like, for example, in previous literature, people have identified this washboard terrain, which is similar to like transverse crevasses or bergschrunds on Earth. In addition, there's this linear terrain. There is discussion in literature about what exactly this is and whether it's a supraglacial feature or a subglacial feature. But if supraglacial, it's kind of like this longitudinal foliation, or if it's subglacial, then it could be more similar to like lineations. However, one interesting thing to consider here is that basically on Mars and within this area, there are different layers of ice and then debris and then ice and debris that can occur. So, for example, even though we have a feature that might be considered supraglacial here, it's still possible that you might have something subglacial down here. And then going on to point out some other features, there's also rectilinear ridges. So these have been compared to push moraines on Earth. And then here we also have polygonal terrain from sublimation, so very similar to the polygonized terrain on Earth as well. So it's clear that there's evidence associated with ice tied to these alcoves, but their actual contribution to how much of the material and volume that was eroded is a little unclear. And just to point out some additional examples of geomorphic features that are present in an association with these Cirque-like alcoves. So in these two images, the Cirque-like alcoves are the ones with the dashed lines, so both here and then here. And so there's this mantling unit. So this is a unit that is often like either it's like ice and dust, and then there can be like multiple layers of it. So here you kind of see that onlapping on top or sitting on top of the alcove. Other features that I mentioned before, linear terrain, polygonal terrain, washboard terrain, and then moraine-like ridges as well. And in addition, you can also see like flow features from the ice. So for future work, something that I'm interested in exploring more is this connection between how these alcoves developed and how that is linked to other features like the gullies I mentioned that have that similar aspect bias. So gullies have been really interesting for people who study Mars because for a while there's been this discussion of, okay, were these gullies formed by recent liquid water or by other processes such as CO2 frost sublimation? So there's kind of like two main groupings of gullies. So one grouping is kind of like older gullies that likely were created by liquid water during times of higher obliquity on Mars. And then also another grouping is younger gullies that are more likely affiliated with CO2 frost sublimation on Mars. And so along similar slopes, so like for example, this is a gully from previous work, we also see alcove development. In the two I'm showing, and I didn't map any of these as Cirque-like alcoves because they didn't match our criteria. But there is still a question of how post-glacial processes are being tied into these slope development features. So for example, like here you can see these flow features of the ice coming away from the mesas. So like this is, again, here, these are the mesas on top, and then these are the ice coming down. So you have flow features both on the left here and also on the right here. And then these slopes are exposed with a combination of different types of alcoves as well as gullies. And so one potential analog to help study this that I'm interested in is also looking at similar features on Earth. So this is an example from Tröllaskagi in Iceland. And here you can see that there are both gullies, so mostly south-facing, and then you have cirques, mostly north-facing. But then you also have other features like alcoves, kind of like in between gullies and cirques as well on these slopes. And so there's this question of, as the basin is being incised more, what is that connection between gully to cirque formation, as well as whether their like relative populations and distributions tell us anything about glaciation in the past in those areas. So for conclusions, I just want to note that in Duralis Mensae on Mars, there are a lot of different erosional processes that have likely contributed to the erosion of the alcoves. But here we're really focusing on the most likely Cirque candidates as evidence of glacial erosion. And these Cirque-like alcoves have a south to southeastward aspect bias, suggesting more favorable climatic conditions during high obliquity, which also corresponds to gully orientation and a potential link between those two landforms. We also observe geomorphic features that are indicative of ice and or the past presence of ice. And finally, Cirque-like alcoves, when we use the types of values of like Mars temperatures and gravity conditions, we find that they can only have timescales consistent with existing glacier-like forms. So like kind of like the kilometer scale glacial landforms if they are eroded by wet-based glaciers. But then if they have cold-based erosion rates over really long timescales, hundreds of millions of years to billions of years, then they can be consistent with the larger multiple kilometers scale size glacial features on Mars. And with that, I'd just like to note, if you're interested, you can scan the QR code to read the paper, and feel free to contact me if you have any ideas for collaboration as well. I'm also looking for postdocs now, so if you have any leads on that, please let me know as well. And thank you so much for listening. And try to exit this. There you go.
All right. Thank you so much, On. Really just fascinating imagery that you've shared with us, and great to see your interpretations there. Questions? We have plenty of time. Anthony, go ahead.
Yeah, so sort of an extensional question, but have you or any of your collaborators worked on numerical modeling to examine sort of some of the glacial dynamics in the Cirque sequences and how that might have expressed itself on the landscape?
So we haven't worked on glacial modeling with Cirque specifically. There has been like glacial modeling on Mars generally, using like I think ISSM and some other types of models. But those, I guess, haven't really like focused as much from the landscape perspective. They've more just focused on like, okay, we see that there's this glacier there, and then based on like what we know about its thickness and different constraints, what can we tell? Like people haven't really approached it from the landscape perspective yet.
Jason, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for a really great talk. I just love hearing about Mars. Okay, so you talked about cirques that don't have glaciers in them today, and then you also showed some imagery of where there is ice or believed to be ice today. Do Can you talk a little bit about, I maybe missed it, but can you talk a little bit about where, like latitudinally, is there a distribution of like where where existing ice is on Mars versus where there's evidence for ice in the sometime in the past, like your cirques?
Mhm. Yeah, so for existing ice on Mars, here I can switch to this slide. So this one, for example, specifically focuses on glacier-like forms, which are kind of like the kilometer scale, kind of like a valley or mountain glacier. And so this is like mapping the volumes. So they're really only present between like 30 to 60 degrees north and south on Mars. But then at the poles, you also have, we call them like the north and south polar layer deposits, which are kind of like ice caps on Earth. So those are like the active or somewhat active glaciers. I say somewhat because they, relative to like flow speeds on Earth, they're really slow. Um, but then in terms of like relict land or just like landforms that might indicate past glaciation, it's very disputed. So there have been some like actually very close to the equator, even like kind of like here you see these volcanoes here on the flanks of those volcanoes. There's been some literature that said, okay, if you look at these features, they're likely an indication of like lava ice interactions. Um, yeah, but I will say it's basically for anything near the equator that doesn't have like actual ice still present. It's very debated and like not really accepted widely by the Mars community.
All right, more questions. Philip, go ahead.
Hi, and I think that I may ask a stupid question. I think that I really like you talk. I just wondering is you talk about glaciers on Mars. Is that by the ice or by the, CO2, the frozen CO2?
Yeah, so mostly ice, especially like in the mid-latitudes. But then in the kind of like polar layer deposits, especially in the north, it's actually CO2 ice as well. And then you also see like CO2 frost in the mid latitudes as well. But I don't remember the exact specifics of the types of calculations that people have done, but basically like we know like the debris covered features in the mid latitudes are ice from radar and then also from like different volumetric calculations. So yeah, people think it's mostly H2O rather than CO2 in the mid latitudes, but CO2 frost and then CO2 ice in the north is also at the north, like polar ice cap is also present.
So given the difference between CO2 and water, so they may have different landforms, right? So
Yeah. Um, at least for the debris covered glaciers I talked about here, people generally think that it's like water, not CO2, but that is an interesting note of like, if we're missing part of the picture by presuming that just because most of the glaciers that are currently there are H2O, that in the past it's always also been that way, and then like kind of expecting the landforms to have been formed mostly that way as well. Yeah, there hasn't been a lot of work looking at like, okay, if we actually expected it was all CO2 glaciers, then what would the landscape look like instead?
okay, thank you very much.
All right, we have time for a couple more questions. Just seeing kudos in the chat is always nice. Keith, go ahead.
Just following up on that, I'm just curious because obviously this is not what I study, but are the rheological differences significant between CO2 ice and water ice?
Yeah. Um, I think there are. This is also like I haven't really looked at CO2 ice that much. But I think I feel like there is a difference in terms of like pore space and that sort of thing. But yeah, I don't want to say too much on it because I haven't looked into CO2 ice that much.
Okay.
Leah, go ahead.
Oh, great. Thanks, talk. Super cool. Like everyone's saying, to see all of these images. Sort of following up on that, but sticking with water ice. Even if it is water ice, I mean, Mars, to my knowledge, has a pretty different gravity than Earth, and like atmospheric pressures are different. So I would assume like, the melting temperature of like water is pretty different on Mars than it is on Earth. So how do you all think about that, especially when you're doing these comparisons between, landforms on Earth versus those on Mars that have these very different sort of background conditions?
Yeah. So I guess I can pull up maybe like this is like a supplementary slide. Yeah, so here, like for example, I took into account G, like the different uh G on Mars, so like 3.71 instead of like 9.81. And from like the glacial erosion rate calculations that I did, I kind of found that like this term didn't actually matter as much as the surface velocity term. And so yeah, it kind of wasn't as or didn't make as big of an impact as I would have expected. Um, and I think in this case, like what mattered more was just like how much time you have to erode the features. So like going into these calculations, I had to make certain assumptions about like based on what we know about past obliquity and like when we expected the ice ages to be, like those were the times when glacial erosion was most likely, and then kind of extrapolate from that to like timescale lengths. But yeah, I think um, for other questions in terms of like how does that actually contribute to like, would it mean like a cirque widens or lengthens more than it is subglacially eroded in terms of like height? Um, I yeah, I didn't go into as many calculations there.
Cool. Thank you.
All right. Any more questions before we sign off for today? All right. Well, thanks to our speakers once again. Thanks everybody for joining on this Friday afternoon. Just a quick reminder, next week we'll have two talks on Thursday afternoon since we're alternating Thursdays and Fridays in our schedule. And if you know anyone who would like to join, please feel free to share the Zoom links. Um, and if anybody wants to, if you know anyone who wants to be on the email list for the working group, just have them send me an email. I'm happy to add them to it. Thanks again, everybody. See you next week.